Hello, and welcome back to the Crime Reel. For today's true crime narration, we shall be visiting Australia, the smallest of the world's 7 continents. We are going to look at the story of Kim and Brian Corrigan. Kim Narelle Tabor was born on the 22nd of August 1964. She was one of 3 children born to Jim Tabor and Nolene Thistle, along with her brothers Rodney and Brian. The family lived in the Kiama area of New South Wales, approximately 75 miles south of Sydney. This coastal town is blessed with beautiful sandy beaches, a dramatic rocky coastline and small boat harbour, which has seen its popularity as a tourist destination rapidly increase over the past few decades. In the 1970s and 1980s, Kiama still had a small town feel, and Kim was well known in the local area. She was popular, friendly and very well liked. She became a member of the Kiama Surf Lifesaving Club and had received a number of awards for her work. Kim was also a keen touch footballer and enjoyed playing baseball. In approximately 1982, when she was around 18 years old, she met a man by the name of Brian Francis Corrigan. Brian was 5 years older than her, with a young son from a previous marriage. Kim and Brian went on to marry about 6 years later in 1988. Kim became an accountant at KPMG at Wollongong, and Brian was an engineer who worked at Shoalhaven City Council. They lived in a small house in Minamura Street in Kiama. In early 1992, when Kim was 27 and Brian 33, they found that they were expecting their first child together. They started to make plans to sell their current home and were hoping to start construction of a new home on some land which they owned in nearby Corrigan. On Thursday, 23rd of July 1992, both Brian and Kim had been to work as usual. Brian returned home at around 4:30 p.m. and decided to go fishing at the nearby Bombo Beach. Kim, who was now around 7 months pregnant, decided to go shopping after work to buy some bits for their baby. When Brian returned home at 9:30 p.m. that evening, he walked into the kitchen and found Kim's body on the floor. It appeared that she had been beaten. Kim was still holding her handbag and was surrounded by the baby items which she had bought earlier that evening. Several items in the house had been disturbed. The police were called, and after preliminary investigations, it did not appear that anything had been taken during the disturbance. Police were initially working on the theory that Kim had arrived home at around 7 p.m. that evening. There were no signs of forced entry, so it was possible that there had been a knock at the front door, which Kim answered, and she was then ambushed by her killer. Neighbours were interviewed, but nothing unusual had been noted during the evening. One neighbour said that her dogs had started barking a lot at around 9:30 p.m, but she had not thought that that was anything unusual. The post-mortem revealed that Kim had actually been shot, not beaten. She had been shot twice in the head with a .22 caliber weapon. One shot was fired from a distance, the second at point-blank range. The police investigation was led by Detective Senior Sergeant Peter Wood of Warilla Police Department. The initial search of the surrounding area by homicide detectives and forensic experts did not result in any additional information or the discovery of the murder weapon. Brian had informed police about a young man who had been seen hanging around near their house prior to the murder. On 26th of July, a 24-year-old man was arrested and questioned by police. However, the following day, this man was released without charge, having been cleared of any involvement in the murder. By this point, police had ruled out robbery as a motive for the killing, and they were concentrating on numerous leads obtained from friends, relatives, and neighbours. Police started to become concerned for Brian's welfare after he disappeared for several hours, and when he reappeared, he was in a dishevelled state with wounds on his wrists, consistent with him having attempted to take his own life. Kim's funeral was held on the 28th of July 1992 at the Lakeside Crematorium with over 300 people present. An hour before the funeral, Brian took part in a police conference alongside Kim's mother, Nolene. He appealed to the public to come forward with any information that could assist the police in the investigation of his wife's murder. At the funeral itself, Brian became too distressed to speak, and Kim's father, Jim, gave an extremely emotional eulogy about his daughter, who had been taken from them in the most horrific of circumstances. The investigation continued, and 9 days later, on the 6th of August 1992, the police began questioning a 34-year-old man as a result of ballistic and forensic evidence which had been found. At 1:30 a.m. on the 7th of August, 34-year-old Brian Corrigan was charged with his wife's murder. The following day, Brian appeared in Wollongong Court, where he pleaded not guilty. He was refused bail by the magistrate, Mr. Keith Dale, despite having no previous convictions. The police prosecutor told the court that they had extremely strong forensic evidence implicating Brian. Police had located a rifle which had been cut into small pieces and hidden in various places throughout Kim and Brian's house. Some of the pieces were also in Brian's car. Brian claimed that he had cut up this weapon the day before his wife was murdered. However, ballistic tests confirmed that it was the murder weapon. Brian's barrister attempted to get the location of the trial moved away due to the publicity the case had received. This request was denied, as over 50 prosecution witnesses all lived within the local area. The trial eventually began in March 1993. Brian elected to be tried by judge alone. After initially denying any involvement in Kim's murder, Brian changed his story. He advised that ever since the day that Kim's pregnancy had been confirmed, he had been hearing voices in his head, and that he was convinced that Kim no longer loved him and was going to leave him and take the baby with her. These voices had been increasing in intensity, and he had started to drink heavily in an attempt to silence them. These voices were particularly traumatic for him, as he had also suffered from them during the breakdown of his first marriage. Brian stated that he had left work early on the 23rd of July and was planning to kill himself so that he could silence the voices once and for all. When Kim arrived home that evening, the voices tricked him into believing that she was actually his first wife, Caroline. Seeing the bags that Kim was carrying, the voices convinced him that Kim was in the process of leaving him. He told the court that he could not remember shooting his wife, but accepted that he must have done it. Throughout his testimony, Brian referred to himself in the third person and wept while providing details of that evening. He pleaded not guilty to murder, but guilty to manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility. The prosecution, however, completely dismissed this version of events. They provided evidence that Brian was a childish, shallow man who could not deal with what he saw as the constraints of marriage and fatherhood. During the course of his relationship with Kim, he'd had multiple affairs and a string of one-night stands. Just 6 days before Kim's murder, he had spent the night with another woman, a fact that Kim was unaware of. In addition, he had told multiple younger women at his workplace that he was single and his marriage was already over. The prosecution produced evidence of a 350,000 Australian dollar insurance policy which would be payable to Brian in the event of Kim's death. The prosecution also argued that once ballistics proved that Brian was a killer, he resorted to concocting a psychiatric defence. However, as the murder had been planned and Brian had created a false alibi, this psychiatric defence was undermined. As the trial was nearing a close, events took a dramatic turn. On 9th of March 1993, Brian requested permission to give extra evidence. He then admitted to the court that he had been telling a series of outrageous lies throughout the trial. He said that he had actually shot his wife after telling her that he was no longer interested in being married to her. He then disrupted their house and invented the fishing alibi in order to deceive the authorities. Brian then admitted he did not have a memory block, could clearly remember the events of the 23rd of July, and had deliberately lied to the police. As Brian was being moved from the witness box, one of Kim's brothers jumped from the seat and punched Brian, sending him reeling back into the dock. 2 days later, On the 11th of March, Brian was found guilty of the murder of his wife Kim. He was never charged for the death of their unborn daughter. The following month, he was sentenced to 22 years in jail with a non-parole period of 16 years. It later came to light that Kim's father, Jim, had been working extremely closely with the police from the beginning of the investigation. He had been made aware that the police had been concentrating their inquiry on Brian since the day after his daughter's murder. However, despite the numerous mistakes Brian had made that led police to believe he was the killer, they needed to make sure that they built a solid case against him. In order to do that, they waited for forensic and ballistic evidence before he was charged. The police had deliberately arranged the press conference on the day of Kim's funeral in an attempt to flush out further witnesses and gain additional details of the double life that Brian had been living. Jim had to sit next to Brian at his daughter's funeral, knowing that he was in all likelihood sitting next to his daughter's killer. Kim was buried under her maiden name of Tabor, not her married name. 16 years later, on 4th December 2008, the State Parole Authority issued an intention to grant parole to Brian Corrigan. There was a public hearing on the 21st of January 2009. Brian represented himself via video link and showed no emotion or remorse. During his time in prison, Brian had been a model prisoner, completing all rehabilitation asked of him and studying for 2 degrees in arts and engineering. As Brian had completed his minimum term, this hearing was merely a formality. Kim's family were in attendance but did not address the hearing as they were resigned to the fact that Brian would be released on parole. On February the 5th, 2009, 50-year-old Brian walked out of prison as a free. There was no one there to meet him. Kim's family believed that he should never have been released as he was a manipulative man who lashed out when he could not get what he wanted. They believe he is still a threat to society. The lead police officer on the case, Peter Woods, also agreed that this man should never be allowed to walk free again. Brian's whereabouts today are unknown. That concludes the story of Kim and Brian Corrigan. If you have any comments, please add them down below. If you want to tell us any stories about New South Wales, then please add them in the comments. Thanks for listening to The Crime Reel. Stay safe. Goodbye. Psst, I just wanted to say, Master Jeep Hightower, well done on your 1-year anniversary being free from prescription drugs. Congratulations on reaching that milestone. Keep it going, you got this. That was day 6 or 7. We're getting there. Goodbye.